miss you. We're very pleased and honored to have with us here Ireland's Director for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, Jackie O'Halloran Bernstein. As you all know, Ireland has played a leading role in the global disarmament and non-proliferation regime over the years. Ireland was not only one of the key players in the Prohibition Treaty negotiations, but Ireland helped catalyze the work towards the NPT itself with its 1958 UN resolution proposing to prohibit the further dissemination of nuclear weapons. So, as I said earlier, we can't take the NPT for granted. And just in a couple of weeks, as we heard, the representatives of the states parties to the NPT are going to gather in Geneva for the preparatory committee meeting, the next one for the 2020 review conference. So I've asked Jackie to share her views and her government's views on the successes and shortcomings of the NPT over the years, the challenges facing the disarmament and non-proliferation enterprise, and the Irish government's recommendations of how we can move forward next. So thank you very much for being here. And then afterwards, we'll take a few questions from the audience.
Thank you very much, Darrell. And thank you so much for inviting me here today to speak on behalf of Ireland and also the fellow recipients of the 2017 Arms Control Person of the Year Award. Distinguished guests, I'm deeply honoured that Ireland has been asked, on behalf of the delegations of Austria, Brazil, Costa Rica, Mexico, New Zealand and South Africa, and our chairwoman, Elaine White-Gomez, to deliver this keynote address today. The theme for our meeting, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty at 50, strengthening and reinforcing the regime, offers a timely chance for reflection and for dialogue ahead of the opening next week of the second preparatory committee of the NPT's 2020 review cycle. 50 years on from the opening for signature of the NPT, there are indeed many reasons to celebrate, not least the continued salience and importance of the treaty, and now the addition of a new and exciting legal instrument which will make a strong contribution to the NPT's Article 6, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I'd like to thank the Arms Control Association for nominating our group of delegations and chairperson Elaine White-Gomez for the award. And I'd also like to thank those who voted for us for their support and the mark of trust which they've placed in the treaty, its purposes and objectives. I'd also like to mention here the other delegations who participated in what was a remarkably open, collaborative and collegial process with a determination to reach a successful conclusion. I think, as indeed our chairperson mentioned, that there were many different voices heard at those negotiations, and voices that are not often heard at the United Nations or in multilateral disarmament discussions. In particular, we heard the voices of the Hibashka and of the survivors of nuclear testing. The treaty, which resulted from this process, is truly groundbreaking, not only in its prohibitions on the weapons, but also in its acknowledgement of the role of the Hibashka, of its provisions on victim assistance and cooperation and on the environment, and also for including commitments in relation to disarmament education and the full and equal participation of men and women in the work of the treaty. In 1958, when Ireland's then Foreign Minister, Frank Aiken, introduced to the United Nations the first of the Irish resolutions which would eventually lead to the adoption of the Non-Proliferation Treaty 10 years later, the prospect of a world where many actors, states and non-state, would eventually acquire the means and the technology to build their own nuclear arsenals was very real. In that speech, which remains as prescient and true today as it was 60 years ago, Frank Aiken speaks of how weapons, which are the monopoly of the great powers today, become the weapons of smaller powers and revolutionary groups tomorrow. The speech makes it clear that while abolition of the weapons and permanent disarmament was Ireland's goal, the immediate pragmatic need was to prevent further dissemination of the weapons. As we assess the NPT at 50, we can, I believe, agree that the treaty has, to a good extent, achieved its objectives. Very few states have remained outside the treaty and gone on to develop nuclear weapons. It is indeed one of the most participated in UN treaties. The 5 nuclear weapon states have all joined it and are therefore bound by the commitment contained within its Article 6 to nuclear disarmament, which remains the core legal obligation binding the nuclear weapon states to disarm. This is also evidenced by the unequivocal undertaking that they gave in 2000 to accomplish the total abolition of their nuclear weapons. Additionally, the states of many regions of the world have chosen to be part of nuclear weapons-free zones in strong demonstration of their commitment to the objective of a world without nuclear weapons. Some of the strongest voices in the room at the TPNW negotiations came from these regions and brought the strength of their convictions and experience to the treaty negotiations. The NPT itself is a slim treaty. Its preamble and 11 articles fitting easily on 6 A4 pages. But the international community has built around it a strong framework of supporting institutions. The International Atomic Energy Agency, in particular, though pre-dating and independent from the NPT, has built up an impressive structure of expertise and an enabling framework to facilitate the use of nuclear technology for peaceful purposes, while implementing strict safeguards which prevent diversion to non-peaceful uses. With the development of supporting export control regimes, including the Nuclear Suppliers Group and the Missile Technology Control Regime, states have been successfully assisted in preventing and inhibiting proliferation of nuclear weapons and ballistic missile technology, without preventing transfers of technology and materials for peaceful uses. This aspect of the treaty is also an essential one to which states parties need to continue to give careful support and attention. The NPT has also, through the strengthened review process agreed at the 1995 Review and Extension Conference, helped to promote and give impetus to many far-reaching agreements and understandings aimed at preventing further proliferation and enabling bilateral nuclear disarmament. The bilateral accords between the Russian Federation and the United States have also been greatly supportive of the NPT aims, with the INF, START and New START treaties contributing to a welcome and significant reduction in the large stockpiles of nuclear warheads which had built up during the Cold War. Equally, the CTBT must also be counted amongst the NPT's successes. While it hasn't entered into force, nevertheless, the strength of the global norm which has been established against nuclear testing and the development of the CTBTO's international monitoring system has been one of the great achievements of the international community in nuclear disarmament. Today's award, marking the adoption of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, represents the NPT's latest success story and the first new legal instrument on nuclear disarmament to be adopted in over 20 years. A success story not only because of the groundbreaking content of the treaty, but also because of what it entails in terms of progress towards the fulfillment of the NPT's disarmament provisions. Article 6 of the NPT expressly envisaged a separate and complementary treaty on general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control. The TPNW is not founded on a grand bargain whereby states agree to give up the possible military advantages and the status attached to being nuclear weapons possessors in exchange for an agreement that the nuclear weapon states will disarm. Instead, the states who adopted the treaty agree to an unambiguous and unconditional commitment that they'll never, under any circumstances, develop, test, produce, manufacture, otherwise acquire, possess, or stockpile nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. I think Frank Aiken, 50 years after the entry into force of the NPT, would be pleased that the TPNW finally implements and gives effect to the NPT's disarmament provision, and that almost 2/3 of the UN membership are committed to the complete prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons, and that this took place from an appreciation of the elevated risk and catastrophic consequences which would result from a nuclear weapons detonation, accidental or deliberate, for the security of all humanity and the future of our fragile planet. Our states are making this choice. It is our great hope that in time, all others, including the nuclear weapons possessor states and their allies, will join us. Frank Aiken was a strong supporter of the idea of the sovereign equality of all states and a firm believer in the equalizing power of the United Nations. He would, I think, have approved of the inclusive and respectful nature of the deliberations which led to the adoption of the treaty, both in the 2016 open-ended working group, so ably chaired by Ambassador Thani of Thailand, and also at the TPNW negotiations, where Ambassador White-Gomez played such a strong role in bringing the deliberations on the treaty to a successful conclusion. In addition to the TPNW, there have been other welcome advances in disarmament and arms control in recent years, including the entry into force of the Arms Trade Treaty in 2014, the Joint Common Plan of Action with Iran in 2015, and the agreements at CCW to establish a group of governmental experts to address the challenges raised by autonomy in weapon systems. These achievements show that the international community, states, and civil society can achieve our goals when we can agree and focus on a common purpose. But huge challenges confront us. Growing urbanization has led to massive increases in civilian casualty rates and damage to civilian infrastructure in our cities from the use of conventional explosive weapons. The JCPOA negotiated with such effort and attention, and despite careful and positive implementation assessment by the International Atomic Energy Agency, is under threat. The Arms Trade Treaty is experiencing significant challenges in universalization and in implementation, while 100 years on from the Battle of Ypres, chemical weapons are again being used, both in war and to assassinate, despite the universal prohibition on their use. Meanwhile, returning to the NPT and our theme today, nuclear disarmament by the NPT nuclear weapons states has stalled. Bilateral nuclear disarmament between the US and the Russian Federation following the successes of the INF and a New Start, has halted. After the successful outcome of the NPT's 2010 review conference, with its ambitious but achievable action plan, including an innovative approach to progress on a Middle East zone free of weapons of mass destruction, the 2015 conference did not agree an outcome. The CTBT, despite the successes that I mentioned, has still not lived up to its promise of an end to the damage and destruction caused by nuclear testing by entering into force. Modernization and investment in nuclear arsenals is rising in all nuclear weapon states, and efforts to reduce the salience of nuclear weapons in military doctrines and in nuclear alliances has receded. Proliferation threats are increasing, with DPRK's nuclear program representing a particularly dangerous development. Against this background, the norm against the threat of use of nuclear weapons has been seriously eroded, and the world's citizens, after decades of post-Cold War complacency, are awakening to the harsh reality that yes, nuclear weapons do still exist, and that the hands of the doomsday clock are yet again at 2 minutes to midnight. So what to do now? Against this somewhat grim background, and against a moment when we have seen disarray and lack of agreement at the United Nations Security Council on an issue in which there should be overwhelming global agreement and abhorrence, such as chemical weapons use, it seems utopian to suggest that NPT states parties should renew their efforts to engage with each other and genuinely find ways forward to overcome the divisions on approaches to nuclear disarmament, which have become evident in recent years. But that is exactly what we need to do. If the NPT could be negotiated and adopted at the height of the Cold War, then a renewed commitment to its implementation and the establishment of dialogue among its states parties is more than possible. I am not going to list here the 13 steps of the actions from the 2010 action plan on which all are agreed. Neither am I going to set out the steps put forward by the proponents of the progressive or step-by-step approach to nuclear disarmament. Ireland and the other delegations to the TPNW here present are also all committed to making progress on these measures, and many of our countries have engaged actively in the work to make them happen. There is, however, one issue on which I do want to speak in more detail, and that's the question of the Middle East zone free of weapons of mass destruction and their means of delivery. As we reach the midpoint of the NPT's 2020 review cycle, with little or no progress, it is time for a serious stock-taking and reassessment of how we can achieve some progress in spite of the challenges and difficulties on this issue. Otherwise, the risk that the 2020 review cycle will also fail to agree an outcome is strong, with a resulting strongly negative impact on the treaty. Ireland has proposed at last year's preparatory committee that a dedicated resource should be provided, possibly within UNODA, who could assist the co-conveners and other interested states and civil society actors to develop creative and innovative proposals, and in particular confidence-building measures, which could begin to move the process forward. Trust and confidence are key to the success of any negotiation, and this is what we need most of all. Earlier this month in Ireland, we celebrated another auspicious moment in our history, 20 years of the Good Friday Agreement and the success of the Northern Ireland peace process. We looked back, we looked at the present, and we looked forward. The agreement has had many challenges. It hasn't always lived up to its promise as a beacon of hope and reconciliation, but it has endured, and the hard-earned peace which it represented has lasted in spite of all the difficulties, including those that confront it today. That achievement wasn't built in a few weeks of negotiations, or only through the dedication, courage, and preparedness to take risks of some leaders, though that wasn't lacking either, and deserves the recognition which we give to the architects of the agreement. But rather, it was built up through decades of work within communities, schools, churches, within labour movements, business associations, political parties, academics, think tanks, working together or as individuals to establish lines of communication, to start a conversation, to build bridges instead of walls, to have a cup of coffee instead of shouting across the barricades. Mostly, it was built by starting conversations and by listening to the other's viewpoint. It was also built by women, reacting to the loss and devastation within their communities and determined to end the violence once and for all. Within the NPT process, we speak often of needing to identify the bridge builders, those states, groups of states, civil society actors, leaders who can find a way forward to bridge the divisions between those who seek immediate and non-conditioned implementation of the NPT's disarmament provisions and related commitments, and those who believe that while nuclear disarmament is the ultimate goal of the NPT, the conditions are not yet right for it to happen. Next week, with the opening of the second preparatory committee, we can all be bridge builders. Those who believe that nuclear disarmament is essential to creating the conditions for a peaceful and secure world, and those who believe we must create a peaceful and secure world before nuclear disarmament can happen. When speaking of the Good Friday Agreement last week and the need for renewed commitment to its implementation and objectives, our Deputy Prime Minister, Simon Coveney, said, "Renewal does not demand perfection. It demands leadership, courage, and hard work." For the NPT, we also need leadership, courage, and hard work. Most of all, we need to begin a dialogue to find what works and what can bring us nearer to the realization of our mutual goal, a world without nuclear weapons and a successful outcome to the 2020 review cycle. There are already some promising green shoots in the Chairman's draft summary from last year's preparatory meeting, including the recognition of gendered impacts of nuclear weapons and the need to increase women's participation in nuclear disarmament forums. To conclude, one of the other nominees for this distinguished award last year, Pope Francis, in his thinking on nuclear disarmament, has said that a world without nuclear weapons will not be this world just without nuclear weapons. It will be a different world. For those of us who want that different world, it's time to begin both imagining and creating it. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for some questions from the floor for Jackie O'Halloran and Bernstein, and before we take a short break before our first panel of the day. So we have microphones with my staff here, Liz and Ryan and Sidra. So please just raise your hand, identify yourself, ask your question, and start with. Sure.
Hi, my name is Phineas Anderson. In terms of the Middle East Free Zone, what kind of negotiations have you had with Israel? Because it seems the chance of them coming around to give up their weapons is next to nil.
Thank you very much. My understanding is that the co-conveners, you know, they they do engage and they try to discuss with all the actors in the region, but that there has been no movement effectively since 2015. And of course, what is agreed in terms of the Middle East Free Zone is that whatever moves forward has to be with the agreement of all the actors in the region and all states in the region. So that includes, that Israel would engage voluntarily, and that whatever happens has to be inclusive and participatory. But there has been very little movement since the failure to agree an outcome in 2015. And there have been various, discussions among actors in the region. But apart from the civil society track, where there is a little bit of movement and some confidence building going on, my understanding is that very little has happened. Thank you.
I would just note on the zone, Ireland has worked very hard on this. Ambassador Alison Kelly of Ireland chaired the subgroup at the 2010 NPT review conference on this issue, and Tom Countryman, who worked this issue for the U.S. government when he was Assistant Secretary. Other questions from the floor? Yes, I see a hand, but not a face. Sir.
Yes, my name is Pedro Cruz, and when you mentioned the importance of women's participation, is that because men have failed, or because there needs to be a better biological mix?
All right. It's a good question. I'm glad a man asked. Have men failed? Probably yes.
Thank you very much. And this is an issue which is very close to my heart. Ireland has taken a very strong position on the need for greater women's participation in disarmament generally, but in particularly in nuclear disarmament. And the impetus for this grew in part from the evidence that was presented at the Vienna Humanitarian Conference of the strongly gendered impact of ionizing radiation as between women and men and boy children and girl children. But it's also from, the evidence that came out, I think particularly funnily enough, from business and economic research after the 2008 crash, that the greater the diversity in your organization or your company, whatever it is, the better outcomes and the better solutions there are to problems. So it is that we do feel that disarmament, and particularly nuclear disarmament, has a huge challenge as regards diversity. And this is in terms of gender, where the participation has been shown by research done by UNIDIR to lag way behind what it is in other similar negotiating forums. But it's also, coming back to your question, indeed, that it's not that we necessarily think that the men have done a bad job, but that we think a more equal and representative participation. And that includes also between countries, actually. And I think our president made a really good point earlier in the discussion when she said that the TPNW negotiations allowed a lot of smaller states whose voices are not normally heard to be heard. And this is something we really want for the NPT. We also want much better geographical representation of countries, but particularly we're focused on the gender issue at the moment. Thanks.
Other questions? Yes, sir. Would any women like to ask questions?
Hi, I'm Bruce McDonald with Johns Hopkins SICE, teach the Non-Proliferation course there. And I wanted to compliment you and for your work on disarmament, and also Ireland's role. And also what this audience may not be aware of is your distinguished work with the Druid Theatre Company, and how wonderful that is. What's outstanding theater company in Ireland. I wanted to ask what you thought might be done to encourage a more positive attitude among publics in the United States and in and in Russia, take two countries in particular, to promote a more positive feeling toward arms control. It's arms control's public persona, if you will, seems to me in some ways has deteriorated in the last 15, 20 years. And I wonder if you had any suggestions or advice for us.
I do believe that civil society and academia, also, you know, good research and think tanks have a huge role to play in bringing arms control more into the consciousness of people and getting greater support for it. It is a little bit what I said in my speech, that it needs to start with a lot of different conversations happening at different levels and at individual levels. I believe that Pope Francis's work will, in time, be hugely influential in the Catholic communities in the United States, because the Vatican stance has changed so radically from one which kind of reluctantly accepted that you know, you had to keep some weapons for deterrence purposes, to now, you know, saying that their possession is wrong. And I think in time that will, you know, filter down and will have an effect. I believe there is quite a strong nuclear disarmament community in the US, and that ICANN and the winning of the Nobel Peace Prize should also help with that. Obviously, in the Russian Federation, it is a difficult issue, but I think the focus on the risks particularly is something that could be useful, and that the more work that is done on risk and the more that is disseminated among publics and awareness created, that is maybe the way to go in publics that are more resistant. And also, of course, who maybe have more to lose from nuclear disarmament in terms of the economics of nuclear weapons.
I thought that was a good question. Just one quick footnote I wanted to add on the civil society. The Arms Control Association is commission. So we're reaching out to our colleagues in Russia to try to how to break a copy of the statement that we on the U.S. Russia crisis on the table outside. So it is an important part of it. It's been part of the solution in the past, and it needs to be part of the solution. Other questions from the crowd? We have a couple more. Why don't we go to the very rear? I see a former.
Could you use the mic, please?
Yeah. Where's my microphone?
There's one here, John.
On your
Yeah,
side.
well, this is supposed to be working. All right.
I would like to say a couple of words about where we are today. It seems, reference to what's been mentioned just a few moments ago. What we have a problem in America today is that we have no peace party anymore. We have a conservative Republican tendency to be careful about arms control, and we have a Democratic Party that is opposed to everything that has to do with Russia. That's a fact. And we can ignore those facts to our regret. It seems to me that the real problem today is to develop a constituency for arms control in spite of the problems that we have. We've been through periods like this before. I've been through periods like this before. And there's a way to overcome it. But you've got to have political support for the effort to control nuclear weapons in spite of the conditions that exist in the world today. I think back 50 years ago when we finally signed the NPT. I didn't think it would last this long as strong as it is. And we're fortunate that we have that, but to move forward from that for the other arms control efforts, we've got to devote ourselves to developing a renewed constituency for arms control. Most of the people in the Congress of the United States know nothing about arms control because there haven't been negotiations and discussions of negotiations since they came into office. So that's a central part of what we have to do if we're going to be serious.
Thank you. For those of you who don't know, that's Larry Weiler. He helped negotiate the NPT. He is one of our stalwart friends. So I'll let you respond to Larry's wise words, but let's take one more question before we take a break. And no female questioners here. All right, we're trying. We have one here. All right. All right. Well, here, Laura.
Laura Kennedy. Happily to say I'm a private citizen, although I did spend most of my career working on Russia, arms control, non-proliferation, and so on. So I just had a few thoughts on that. I really appreciated your views on women. I'm happy to say that not so long ago, I participated with some other female arms control, non-proliferation folks in a meeting with the women in Congress who are on Armed Services Committee and so on. So things like that are a great opportunity. Someone, I think you said about Russia, I think bears a lot of work. The Deep Cuts Commission, I think, was a great opportunity to get at some of these issues. But of course, these are the professional elites. I actually started off my career at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow participating as a guide in one of our efforts at public diplomacy to try and reach out beyond the capitals, where we had a 50-year exchange with Russia, where we would get out and have exhibits all around the country. Frankly, I think that's something we ought to look at. How do you engage publics? Because frankly, in Russia, there is no equivalence with what we face here. There is none. So let's think about ways we can get beyond capitals and try and engage those publics. That's a huge challenge out there. But anyhow, thank you for everything you've said today and your work.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank Larry Weiler for his contribution, which I think is really important. And I think this conversation now and thinking about how to engage publics and that way how to make sure that you have support for your politicians is just so important. And of course, it's something I have to step back and think about because in Ireland, nuclear disarmament, you know, as a goal, as a global goal, is simply a given, and it's something that enjoys complete support across all our political spectrum. But we do take the disarmament education, commitments that are there in the NPT and that are now very much there in the new treaty very seriously. And, you know, we think it's particularly important to reach out to younger people, because this complacency has grown up that nuclear weapons maybe are no longer so important. I do think some recent developments have perhaps changed that perception, and that our young people are maybe more aware now that actually no, their 15,000 nukes are all still available to the leaders who want to or feel they need to use them. So that first step has, I think, been taken in creating a consciousness, and now it's a matter of building on it. We find, and this is just one throwaway, that using film as a medium is particularly useful for reaching out to younger people. And we have organized some nuclear-themed film festivals, and that has been, we found that has given a lot of return in terms of interest. So that is one idea, but there's definitely a big job of work to be done there. And that's another reason why I really look forward to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons coming into force, because there's an actual commitment in that on states to carry out disarmament education activities. And that, I think, will give disarmament education a huge impetus and push, which it needs.
Thank you very much, Jackie O'Halloran Bernstein. Please join me in thanking her for her contributions and for Ireland's steadfast work on non-proliferation and disarmament.